Over the last year, you've explored a number of themes related to the web world. What are the most active or interesting parts about those themes?
Well, the one that's really reverberating regularly is the web works at every scale. I keep seeing, there was a conversation here today at Fluent about scaling up an application to millions and millions and millions of users. That's one obvious piece of it. But another thing that just keeps happening and becoming more normal is the scaling down to whatever mobile device the person happens to have. We've kind of come past the era of doing a separate mobile site for things. There are still M sites, they're called M dot whatever, but it's become a lot more normal to create the same thing for multiple targets. And it's a weird combination sometimes because you'll have this application with a giant back end that's scaling up, and then you'll have all of the front ends kind of scaling down. And this is just the way people work now. So that's been a big normalization of something that used to seem really weird on both ends. Responsive web design helped to some extent with that. Better conversations about scaling have helped with that. There have been a lot of different pieces to that. The other thing that I keep seeing, and I see this, we're at an event, so you see community much more visibly, but the kinds of communities we're seeing are evolving. Developers aren't just on Twitter or Stack Overflow. Slack has created a lot of spaces for people who might be at the same company or might not be at the same company. IRC has always existed, of course, as kind of the developer's instant communication tool, but Slack has brought it to a lot more people. So it's not clear yet what kind of a change that's going to make, but it is kind of fun to see things like a team set up so that there are topic-specific channels maybe, and then channels that are meant to bring together different groups from a team. Kind of one of the classic ones I've seen is a designer-programmer mix. So the designers have their own space, the programmers have their own space, but there's also a space set up for them to talk to each other.
That makes sense.
It's a lot of notifications, I guess, but it's, they're the right notifications, so that works out okay. The other one, a year ago I wrote about this Cambrian explosion of tools, and it was amazing, and it was great. And it turns out there are some downsides to that kind of an explosion. You have to figure out what your tool set is going to be every time you build a new project. So the current word is fatigue. We're also getting fatigue. So it's gone recursive, and we're going to have complications. A lot of that's on the JavaScript side. People have built these workflows that are incredibly intricate to combine all of these different parts. And in theory, they're automating everything hard away. And it works great until it doesn't. And then you have to figure out what happened. So it's brilliant, but it's still kind of rickety. We're figuring this out. And everybody does it differently. So handing things off gets exciting. I felt a lot better when I looked at a whole set of Docker stacks, because there were clearly even more combinations going on in that document than what I'm used to seeing. So I know we're not alone, but it is a beautiful and complicating thing.
What surprised you about any of the things you've been investigating?
Well, the biggest change in the last year or two, it goes back a long ways. There's always been a conversation about security. There have been lots of questions around identity and privacy. But I think to a big extent, the Snowden revelations kicked those up much higher than they had been before. A lot of sort of personal experience people have had on social media with being visible. So your identity might be visible, but people who are coming to say nasty things about you aren't, and how do we handle all of that kind of stuff? Facebook, with its real names policy, has caused a lot of turmoil and thought. I'm not sure everybody's noticed it, but anybody who didn't have a real name has had some complication. And some of the people I've had to refollow had names that were completely innocuous, and I'm just like, okay, this is different. The impact of that, though, is really different depending on where you are. So I still have conversations with folks who are in Silicon Valley or in New York, and they're advertisers and marketers and tracking companies and advertising auctions. They don't see what the big deal is. Then I read things from Europe, and I talk to Germans, and they're all like, this Google thing, it's becoming evil. And we don't understand why anybody would take this path to combine all of this data about a single person unless, well, they have experience with the Stasi. It's a different echo on that side of the Atlantic, and particularly in that country. So between Snowden and between these different cultural factors, I don't think we're seeing solutions arise yet, but the conversation is taking off. The level of conflict has definitely risen. It ties to something else I talked about, the data-driven nature of these things. And I think the New York and Silicon Valley conversation is still more about all of this awesome data. And the identity, privacy, security questions ride alongside that, and sometimes these things collide. I don't think the web is going to break over these things, but I think it's going to be a very slow figuring out what actually do we want to be doing here.
Interesting. Who is doing the most interesting work in the spaces you've been exploring?
Well, actually, so it fits really well with what I was just saying, although I'm hoping that it's not the evil conversation. Google obviously has done a lot of stuff on the data side. They've done all of these things with search. They've got the Chrome browser. They've got all of these things going. The keynote today that kind of caught my attention for where the web is going is the progressive web apps conversation. Alex Russell was talking about how you can shift from a model where it's like a native app that's consuming data over the web to really doing it web forward. Google does many things, but one of the big things they push regularly is let's keep things on the web as far as possible. So that's building on all of these other things and really pushing it forward. We have a couple of projects that it's interesting. So one of our keynotes tomorrow is Douglas Crockford talking about SAFE. He's been concerned basically since he encountered the web that it doesn't work very well for security, and we keep finding ways that there are issues. So he's proposing a totally different track. But it's interesting because so much of his work is really centered on the web and made the web happen in some ways, the JavaScript side especially. Brendan Eich gave a keynote this morning. He's the creator of JavaScript. He didn't talk very much about what he's doing right now, but Brave is a browser he's working on that is all about privacy. And so it's a different way to address it. Instead of, we have these browsers, it's cool. If you have this plugin, we'll make an exception for how it works. It's changing the defaults is the other way to address this. So those are some specific companies and people doing things. There's something else happening, though. The way that we build and deploy apps has gotten a bit more intricate. So there was a while when you could deploy, you still do it. You create an application as a web thing, and you wrap it in PhoneGap or Cordova, and Ionic, you send these things out. That's becoming more normal on the server side. The Docker story has, up until now, really been kind of an operational concerns thing, and it's moving further and further into the developer world. Here at Fluent, it's just getting started. I think most people are still building applications, and how they get deployed is either somebody else's problem or something you solve later. But it's clearly that is moving closer and closer to people building regular web apps. We had a couple of sessions here touching on it. I keep hearing it in the halls. It's making it clear that we are going to be doing this more normally soon.
So last question for you. What are the topics that you're watching right now? What are the on-the-rise things that we should be watching for?
Well, I keep switching back and forth between apps and sites in this conversation. There was a while, when I wrote that Web by Default piece, I felt like they were coming together in a lot of ways. The technology was similar, the tools. The culture turns out to be more and more different. The apps tend to be more about interface, and the sites tend to be more about things like linking and connecting and maybe the web as we originally talked about it, that kind of document collection model, as opposed to a coherent single user interface like a desktop application would be. So that's creating a lot of fractures. At the same time, though, we had a lot of battles 2 or 3 years ago about native apps, and native apps will destroy the web, and kind of like web apps kind of destroyed the desktop apps ecosystem in the past, and so all of these triumphal things never quite work out the way people think. I think the native apps are showing their age. Partly it's, I think, that the initial rush, the gold rush of the App Store, and that we're going to make a ton of money, and that works until everybody shows up, and then nobody's making any money. And the maintenance cost on these things is fairly drastic. And it's every time you get a new version of the operating system, every time they change some corner, you have to fix things up. And that can be painful with web apps. I've done that. But it can be really painful when you have multiple versions of applications across multiple teams.
Right.
And it's not that, it's great if you have multiple teams because they can focus on and fix those things, but staying in sync becomes really difficult if that matters to you. And user expectations management is its own challenge as well. So I don't think that conversation is anywhere near over, but I think we're starting to get a sense of what these things look like in the long term. And my bet is that will actually be good for web apps over time.
Great. Well, thanks so much for stopping by. Really appreciate it.
Great.